We're going to throw now to Thomas Deangelis, who is the lifeblood of the Create Centre, makes everything happen here.
I'd love to hear you extend that metaphor as to what part of the body you are, Michael, but I think I'll just take over right now.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. You never know what I'll come up with.
It's my great pleasure to introduce Lewis Treston, who is a playwright, screenwriter, and also artist in residence at Le Bloc Theatre in Queensland, and also a very good friend of mine. We've worked together as artists a number of times, and it's always a great joy. And Lewis is also an award-winning playwright, having won an award for his, won the Patrick White Award for his play Hot Tub. And also recently has had a number of plays in development at the Sydney Theatre Company, including Meat Eaters and Hubris and Humiliation. Lewis was the playwright for the play that Fraser Caulfield was just talking about, Follow Me Home. And I wanted to chat with Lewis about his experience writing that play, but also his experience as a young person in the theatre and what impact the theatre's had on him over the course of his life. He is quite young. He's older than me, but he's still fairly young.
No, I'm happy with the rumor that I'm young. I like that. When I started, I had a head full of hair. And now after 30 short years in the theatre, nothing grows. So
yes, well, let's see if we can change that, shall we?
Yeah, maybe I'll do some more by the end of the session.
Well, it's lovely to have you here, Lewis. And let's begin by talking about Follow Me Home. As Fraser mentioned, it had a return season, which was unfortunately truncated due to COVID-19. But can you tell me from your perspective what that play was about?
Well, that was a tough one because it was such a discovery, because I was asked, and as Fraser explained, it was a very specific pitch that it needed to be a series of vignettes that somehow demystified youth homelessness. And if I'm totally honest, when I heard that, I was like, well, I don't feel like I have a lot of misconceptions about youth homelessness because I don't know a lot about it. So I felt like the whole process, in order to sort of demystify youth homelessness, I had to sort of come to understanding of what are some of the misconceptions about it. And then through a series of workshops with young people, it was really enlightening and quite harrowing to hear some of their stories and how they were sort of, I guess, experience how they were perceived within society and how incredibly vulnerable they felt, and the deep sort of psychological injury that sort of existed with many of them. And then, like, primarily I write comedy, so it was sort of this really interesting learning curve to be on, and also just to listen. And it was quite a because there was a very formalized way in which, like, sometimes they'd share their stories, but we also indirectly were sort of receiving something of their character through these music workshops that were really led by the wonderful Kerry Digby, who was, such a warm and open person that, I think she just puts everyone at ease so that they begin to sort of reveal who they were. But then when it actually came time to sort of write it and think about this incredibly complicated issue that sort of intersects with every ism you can imagine, and trying to, anyway, it was an incredibly complex issue. But it was always those moments, maybe 30 minutes before the workshop started and 30 minutes afterwards, in which I was sort of given this window into how their lives are actually organized at that specific moment. We would meet them when they were often in refuges and stuff like that, or kind of a bit more along in the process. And then just the level of, this is not criticism because it's necessary, but the level of bureaucracy around how their life is organized was so bizarre. And I would so often hear conversations about them trying to do a normal teenage thing, like go to the doctor or, get to school. And then, like, this entire system was there in lieu of, I guess, an actual sort of nuclear family dynamic. And that, I guess, was for me a really interesting entry point into it, that these are young people who want to sort of, it's not surprising. They just want to live a life like everyone else, which is challenging in and of itself. Like any teenage, everyone always talks about the teenage years being so turbulent. And then when you're homeless, it's just enormously more complicated. Did that answer your question at all?
Yes, it did. It did very, very nicely. I guess I wanted to hear you talk a little bit more about the process, the actual writing process. I mean, it sounds like you were laden with these workshops and material that flowed out of that. And then when it came to sitting down and writing, what was that like?
Challenging. It was really hard. It was just, a series of vignettes, how to sort of break the issue down into a series of events that somehow encapsulate the whole experience. And I realized it really was a matter of concession. It was about kind of drawing parameters around what I could and couldn't actually cover, because, like I said, it is so complicated. But then it became clear, at least within myself, I normally write comedies with dark endings. So I'm like, this is obviously not a comedy. So I need an upbeat. So I was like, it has to be somehow about, really, it's the decision to leave home and then the journey to finding a home again. And I thought that made sense, because I felt uncomfortable with the idea of presenting a sort of hopeless journey. And I think for a lot of people, and like to take, for some people, it is a really dark journey, and it doesn't necessarily end in an upbeat way, but I wanted to sort of somehow excavate a path forward, or at least present that hope, that because otherwise it's just too unbearably sad.
Is there something about theatre or the form of a play that lent it? I mean, vignettes, I think, is there something inherent in the form that was useful to you in terms of telling these stories or addressing these issues?
What I was thinking about, because we had these interviews with young people, it's that sort of balance between the real and the represented, because I was growing increasingly frustrated within myself, because everything sounded like dialogue. I was like, oh my God, how can I embody this voice which is so far from my lived experience? And I'm like, well, I can't. But the sort of combination of real voices that are sort of a transitional device between the sort of scenes that I wrote reminds the audience that of the real voice, of the real experience, and how sort of unglossed it is. Because obviously when you're writing a play, it is a construction. You are sort of, you're not making it up, but you've got to do certain things to sort of hold the audience within an experience, when the actual experience of just listening to someone's story is a totally different thing. But I actually thought that was an incredibly valuable thing to contribute into the theatre experience, that we just need to basically presented them with the source material that I was given, which was their story. And it's like, you make sense of it. It's really hard to reconcile the emotions associated with it. Anyway.
You mentioned a number of things that seem to be connections between each of the young people, particularly around sort of the bureaucracy and so on. But were there other sort of emergent, consistent themes that you encountered in the workshop process or in the writing process between each individual young person?
A lot of sort of living with trauma and the sort of long-term effects of that I found particularly interesting within everyone who I spoke to, that it's just such a long journey to sort of live with, I guess, that tremendous sense of neglect that many of them felt. And then obviously there are real traumas, which out of respect, because I didn't want to represent real violence or real sexual violence, though it is sort of, it is kind of around the scenes. You can sense it when it's there, but I didn't want to stage that just because it just felt wrong, because it kind of takes it away from, I don't want to say the victim, but the young person trying to, once again, find a home. What was the question again? Sorry.
No, I think you answered it. I mean, it's. I think there's an interesting thing about this play, though, in terms of you wanted the more difficult and kind of horrific issues around abuse and somewhat waiting in the wings of the play rather than trying to represent them on stage. And so it's interesting that this online conference is about children's theatre and theatre for young people. There was probably an age limit for young people coming to see this show. Like whilst it was sort of more made by young people and with young people, but really was for everyone.
Yes.
And I think that's often the most powerful kind of young people's theatre in a way that where it can speak across ages and demographics. So I guess my final question for you, Lewis, was can you reflect a bit about what impact the theatre had on your life as a young person in your youth, as so long ago though it was?
I tell this joke all the time, but it's true. I was enrolled in drama class when I was 7 because I had literacy problems. I had problems reading and writing, and now I'm a playwright. So it's just sort of.
So are you cured? Is really what you're saying.
But it was, it was into. I don't know. It's so deeply tied up with my personal experience in terms of developing from a kid into a teenager into an adult. But I guess I was sort of entering it through as a kind of a young person making theatre or participating within it. It was quite a long way into the journey where I started to actually go to the theatre regularly. I think theatre's, for young people especially, I think it's something worth doing. You want to do theatre before you want to see it, I think, for a lot of them. At least that was the case for me. So yeah, I guess I always sort of, my relationship with theatre it was always something I made, as opposed to that moment when you see someone perform and you're like, oh, that's going to be me. For me, I felt like I was always sort of wrapped up in the actual making of it, and then that came afterwards.
Well, thank you very much, Lewis. That was lovely to hear you reflect on that play and your experiences working in the theatre.